Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many of you familiar faces, some less familiar faces. If this is the first time you're joining, I see there are some new members here. Welcome. If I haven't met you personally yet, I look forward to meeting you in the days and the months to come, and particularly on as we enter the new year. Today, we're going to be focusing on the prayer Unetaneh Tokef, which is at the centerpiece of the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur liturgy. It comes at, I'm going to put it up, so you don't need to have it with you. So if you're nervous, don't be nervous. It is really, so it falls in the Musaf service on both mornings of Rosh Hashanah and on Yom Kippur morning, right before the Kedusha, right before the third bracha, the third prayer of the Amidah. And the Kedusha is really the high point of the Amidah when we essentially declare Kadosh, 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 holy, 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 to God at this very peak moment. So Unetaneh Tokef is understood as an entry point into getting us there. People are having issues with the sound? No, okay. If at some point people are having issues, let me know. I see some people in the chat have posted, but it sounds like that was mostly about the music. If there's some issue with you aren't able to hear me, it seems like it might be your computer, not mine, which is good for me, not as good for you. I'm sorry about that. So I think I just would love for a moment as we start to look at this. It's really a liturgical poem. It's a piyut. It's additional. We don't know who the author of Unetaneh Tokef. There's a famous story associated with Unetaneh Tokef that Rav Amnon of Mainz in the 11th century, who was asked basically to denounce his Judaism. And he said he would think about it. And when he said he would think about it, he felt like he had abandoned his faith, and then he was tortured when he was told them that he would not convert, and he was tortured very harshly. They cut off his fingers. It's very graphic, horrible story, and he wrote this poem, and accordingly he came back after he had died and to Rabbi Kalonymus and shared the liturgy, that this poem that he had written. So that's the story, the myth associated with this poem, which is, speaks to a story of martyrdom of Rabbi Amnon, but it is not believed that to be a true story, but the author is unknown, and it's understood to be a poem that was born in the Byzantine era, and we don't know who wrote it. But clearly it's had an enormous amount of power over the course of hundreds of years. And that's illustrated as, even though if you didn't hear it clearly, that Who by Fire by Leonard Cohen is based on this very particular poem. And there's also an incredible story about a kibbutz in Israel called Beit Shita that on the Yom Kippur War in 1973 had 11 of its young men die in battle. And ever since all those coffins were paraded in on Yom Kippur, they've had a memorial ceremony at Beit Shita on Yom Kippur. It's a secular kibbutz, as most people know. In Israel, there's often a very large divide between secular and religious. Less so in our time because there's more of an in between. But at the time, the secular kibbutz, obviously Yom Kippur was transformed into something else because it was a small kibbutz with a huge death toll from the Yom Kippur War. And the story goes that Yair Rosenblum, who was a famous Israeli songwriter, came to the kibbutz on Erev Yom Kippur to spend time there, and felt like he was compelled to offer something to the kibbutz in anticipation of their memorial ceremony. And he basically thought he would do something composed to Kol Nidre. And as he was flipping through the liturgy, he saw Unetaneh Tokef and decided this is definitely the piece. And he stayed up all night composing a melody which was both Ashkenazi and Sephardi with European influence, and also modern Israeli tones as well, and played it at the kibbutz on Yom Kippur towards the end of the day. And it was as if the kibbutz were transformed by this both radically secular place with a radically religious poem, and some intersection between the enormous pain of that the community was carrying with some deep resonance that this poem was able to give them with the melodies that Yair Rosenblum offered. And it became a very famous, it's probably the most widespread melody used in Israel. You can find it on YouTube, and ever since it has been played in that way. So another story of an example where something transported from being on the page of the Mahzor to a community that was not using Mahzorim on Yom Kippur was a place of mourning, and in some way the power of this poetry and the music combined resonated deeply. And while this poem resonates deeply, it also often raises a lot of questions and challenges theologically for folks. And so today we're really going to look at the poem and some of the kind of back resonances of the poem, and how also we might think about the different ways that we can pray this this liturgical poem in ways that can help us grow, and even in our challenges, to make use of our challenges. So I just wanted to, before I pull it up on the screen, if folks are just in the chat, what's your emotion or reaction when you think about Unetaneh Tokef? Just quickly, any thoughts in the chat, just to hear what people are coming up with, and then we'll look at the poetry itself. Okay. Fragility, great. Yeah. So there's a lot of emotions, as people write: fear, vulnerability, awe, mortality, judgment day, uncertainty, right? Like there's just a lot of stuff, right? It is evocative in very many ways, and I think it's hard to not react to it. It's so intense. It also has a number of different components, and so I want to be able to spend a little time of looking at the components of Unetaneh Tokef to see how it holds together as a piece. So I'm going to share my screen. Hold on, let me just get it up. I have so many things on my screen. I have to. There we go. One sec. Okay, so this is from the Mahzor, the Lev Shalem Mahzor. I'm gonna make it a little larger. Is that helpful for people? Okay. So the Unetaneh Tokef is understood to be a certain form of poetry, and there are actually some Christian parallels to this kind of declaration of the sacred power of the day. And most people understand that Unetaneh Tokef is divided into 4 sections. So Unetaneh Tokef, Kedushat Hayom, let us speak of the sacred power of the day. So the first section of Unetaneh Tokef is the declaration that this is Judgment Day, basically, the sacredness of the day. It's a declaration, it's not a negotiation, it's just saying this is what it is. And then the second section of Unetaneh Tokef is really about the notion of the judgment day, that we, God's creatures who are being counted, here it says, right, you recall all that is forgotten and will open the book of remembrance, which speaks for itself, for our hands have signed the page. The great shofar will be sounded, and the still small voice, kol demama daka, will be heard. Angels will be alarmed, seized with fear and trembling, declaring, this very day is the day of judgment, for even hosts of heaven are your judge. No one is innocent in your sight. All that lives on earth will pass before you like a flock of sheep. As a shepherd examines the flock, making each sheep pass under the staff, so you will review and number and count, judging each living being, determining the fate of everything in creation, inscribing their destiny. So, and then it goes through that list after Rosh Hashanah Yikatevun Uviyom Som Kippur Yichatemun. On Rosh Hashanah is written on the fast of the Day of Atonement. It is sealed who will pass on, who will live, and who will die. And that whole long list of all the ways we can survive or not. So this is the second section, which is really about judgment. So I want to say a couple of things just about the language of this part, the first opening paragraphs. Many, and for those who have a strong knowledge of the Tanakh, of the Bible, there are many citations that are embedded in this section. And I'm not going to go through the biblical citations, but there are I think there are 13 citations that appear just in this first two paragraphs, which means in some way the poet is kind of stringing together ideas that are biblical into some kind of whole. The majority of or 9 of those citations are from all over the Tanakh. 4 of them come from the book of Isaiah, which is known, the section that is coming from is also known as Deutero-Isaiah, and kind of the redemption, what part of the redemption idea that lives in Isaiah and Yeshayahu. So just to say that this isn't a poet who's kind of coming up with language that is not already embedded in the tradition. We know Kol Demama Daka is from the story of Elijah. We know, a bunch of these phrases that live in different parts of the Tanakh. And so when we think of the poet, he's using the language of the Bible to create a liturgical poem that holds together. So one of the things I would love to get just folks is reflection on is the image of, as a shepherd examines the flock, making each sheep pass under a staff, so will you review and number and count, judging each living being, determining the fate of everything in creation, inscribing their destiny. So here the notion is that God is a shepherd. And so I'm curious, what the image is of the God being a shepherd and counting God's sheep. What are the what's the feeling that comes up with that idea? It's hard for me, by the way, I can't see with the sharing the screen, I can't see everyone's if you raise your hand, but if you want to put some things in the chat, that will work too. So what's the image with God being a shepherd? Is this an appealing image? Is it what does that evoke? There were a lot of emotions that were evoked by just the poem in general, but yes, Sonia.
I find the image protective and kind. And
beautiful.
So
yeah, go ahead.
Action, his action, then doesn't quite fit it in a sense, but yes, protective and kind.
Right, so that typically we would often associate the shepherding image as an image of care and protection, and sometimes it feels like it's in contrast to kind of what will follow in the poem of the extraordinary amount of judgment that will come forward. Eleanor, what were you going to say?
I feel like it's the quantification of what we live through all year long. And when we come to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, there's no more playing around. You're
Uh-huh.
and uh, and you're scared. So,
And so the shepherd image is not a comforting image. This is with God counting us like we're shepherds. This is more of a fearful, foreboding image for you. Is that true?
well, I can't. We don't do it at BJ, but I grew up my whole life with Hineni.
Uh-huh.
The Shaliach Tzibur leads us to enter this point, to enter the Amidah and get to this point. It's so powerful. I'm not sure I'm thinking about the shepherd, but I am thinking about walking before God.
Beautiful. Okay, so for folks who don't know, the prayer Hineni, I also grew up watching or experiencing a chazan walking down a very long aisle singing Hineni, which is the preparation for the Shaliach Tzibor to essentially carry the kahal through the Amidah, which includes, of course, Unetaneh Tokef. It's like a readiness prayer. So just to say that the notion of God being shepherd and counting God's flock has a certain sense of connection and protection, while also having a certain amount of fear, because we know that the counting is fearful. It's awesome. It's also the reality of life that we know in some way this long list of what will be is true, as Eleanor said, right? The long list is we see every day these ways people die manifest, whether it's in the newspaper or chas v'chalila with people we know or ourselves, all the challenging ways that folks live in the world with fear and with our own mortality. Yes, Joel, I saw your hands. Can you unmute?
Well, I thought of a lot of images like the Akedah, and God wants Abraham initially to slaughter his son, and then the scapegoat for Yom Kippur. So yeah, it can be a very threatening. I remember going to Slichot when I was a kid. It would be 6 o'clock in the morning, and it was just the way people thought, like the people in the community thought, that there would be. This sounds like superstitious, I know now, but that there would be all sorts of spirits while you were going to Slichot, and they could be threatening spirits. And then actually there were bats out. It was at night, and at this particular place there were bats, but it was very, very scary for, like when you're, especially when you're a kid, but there was the idea of possible slaughter. Yeah.
Right. So obviously thank you. This poem evokes our own mortality, right? When we're presented with a list in the second section of the poem with who's going to live a long life and who's going to live a short life, and who's going to die in a fire and who's going to die by drowning. I mean, the description is scary. And for those of us who know people who have had these kinds of death also, and we know in the world that such trauma is real, whether we're in direct relationship with it or not. It does cause harada, like it does cause fear. It does cause, and in some way, I think Eleanor brings up an important point, which on the one hand, there's something that is foreboding on having such a list in front of you. On the other hand, it's actually a day-to-day truth that this is real, but we don't live in facing it every day, right? We can't live in Unetaneh Tokef land, Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur every day, which is, so on these days, we're actually looking at that truth, that reality in the face, right? So the second section really is about judgments and all the ways that God and life will take its course in some peaceful ways and some mostly less peaceful ways. The third section is often where, from a musical point of view, is where the largest emphasis is put, and in some communities, actually, the Aron is Kodesh is closed after Utshuva, Utfila, Utzraka, Ma'avirin et Roa Hagazera, but Tshuva, Tfila, and Tzedakah, but repentance, prayer, and tzedakah have the power. There's a lot of different ways to translate this, have the power to transform the harshness of the decree, have the ability to avert the decree, have the ability to pass over the decree, the harshness of the decree. So this next section, and we see it as it continues, on praise of your accords with your essential nature, slow to anger and easily appeased. These are also images, right, that we know of God. You do not desire the death of the sinner. You don't want us to have these kind of ends, but rather that we change our ways and live. God wants us to do teshuvah, right? God doesn't want to have to see all these things play out. You wait until the day of death. If one returns, you accept that person back immediately. Truly, you are their creator and know the nature of your creatures, that they are only flesh and blood. So this third section is about the human agency, right? It's about our ability to have an impact on how our lives exist. Yes, Irv, just raise your hand, or no?
I did, and it was from earlier, but I would just say that I think there's a tremendous amount of dissonance in this whole prayer, because while the middle section is is definitely reality, and we would like to believe that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, which the first section suggests is presumably what a just God would do. We know that is not reality, and that I always feel this dissonance when we recite this.
Yeah, we're gonna get there. Yeah, for sure. So I just want to go through the sections, and then we're going to address, I think, a lot of the dissonance that we experience, and what we do with that kind of dissonance in the liturgy, of which this is just one example of that. But there are many others examples of it also, because in many ways, the theology writ large of Yamim Nora'im, of the High Holy Days, is embedded in a theology that doesn't manifest in the world that we see, which is that the good are rewarded and the people who sin are punished, that the world doesn't work that way. So this third section is really about the human agency. And if you think about Utshuva, Utfila, Utzedakah, we can think about those as different realms of existence, that tzedakah is between us and other people, tefillah is between us and God, and teshuvah is between us and ourselves in many ways, the returning. So there are different circles of agency and commitment to make that kind of change with the world. Just to say, there's two origins of this phrase, utshuva, utfila, utzedakah, these ideas, like, where did he get that idea? One lives in the Jerusalem Talmud and one lives in the Babylonian Talmud. In the Babylonian Talmud, they're understood to be, I'm sorry, I have COVID, so it just, I'm just plowing through tonight, so you'll just forgive me if I'm a little behind and a little under the weather. But it's good timing because it's not on Rosh Hashanah. So in the Babylonian Talmud, it says that in 16b, there are four things that tear up the verdict. Tzedakah, we know, tzedakah, tza'akah, which is crying out, which one could associate with tefillah, an equivalent of tefillah. Shinui Hashem, a change of the name. And for anyone who studied with me last week, the Halakha and the Mishnah Torah last week, Shinui Hashem is the notion of teshuvah, really, and Shinui Hamaaseh, that the change in the deed, that we have to change who we are to do teshuvah, that it's like we have to distance ourselves from the identity of who we were. So in the Babylonian Talmud, there are 4 examples of things that rip up the decree. In the Jerusalem Talmud in Ta'anit, it's tefillah, tzedakah, and teshuvah, but in the different order. It's reversed. So it's just interesting to note. So some scholars, through some of the leanings that it took a more Jerusalem Talmud approach, think it was more, the poem was created more in the land of Israel than it was in exile. So just some nuggets there. But the poet had obviously these things at his fingertips. Again, embedded in the tradition, he was weaving together stories that were known in the rabbinic period that he fused into this liturgical poem. So that's section 3. And then section 4 really starts with Emet ki ata hu yatzram v'ata yodea yitzaram ki hem basar v'dam. Truly you are their creator and know the nature of your creatures, that they are only flesh and blood. And I think many of us, I think this is another section that resonates very deeply in terms of fragility and mortality, and you could say in a much more gentle way than the list of who shall live and who shall die. Adam yisodao me'afar v'sofo la'afar. Each person's origin is dust, and each person will return to the earth. We know this is also a biblical notion. Having spent life seeking sustenance, Scripture compares human beings to a broken shard, withering grass, a shriveled flower, a passing shadow, a fading cloud, a fleeting breeze, scattered dust, a vanishing dream. And so these are 8 examples of how we as human beings, are mortal. We don't live forever. Our time on earth is limited, and it goes, and all of these images are meant to evoke the same thing, that sense of feeling. And then, of course, we end with the grand ending, Vata hu melech el chai v'kayam, and you are sovereign, you are the sovereign living God. So those are understood to be the 4 sections. And I think Irv's point is well taken, right? They don't always all hang together perfectly. And if they do hang together, it's not necessarily because we believe them to be true, right? In a certain sense, many of us, I think, would say, don't see a world that the relationship, particularly between section 2 and section 3, is true, right? That all the ends that people have in their lives, many of us, I mean, this is obviously the origin of when bad things happen to good people, right? How do we live in a world that doesn't manifest that teshuvah and tefillah and tzedakah actually temper the decree when we're making this statement that doesn't seem to be true? So there are many people who wrestle with this question, Leonard Cohen among them, right? Because I'm just going to share my screen with something else for a minute and just look at his words on his interpretation. Let's see if it works this way. Can you see a different screen now? Okay, excellent. It's doing it. So these are the words of Leonard Cohen's interpretation. And who by fire, who by water, who in the sunshine, who in the nighttime, who by high ordeal, who by common trial, who in your merry, merry month of May, who by very slow decay, and who shall I say is calling? And who in her lonely slip, who by barbiturate, who in these realms of love, who by something blunt, who by avalanche, who by powder, who for his greed, who for his hunger, and who, shall I say, is calling? And who by brave ascent, who by accident, who in solitude, who in this mirror, who by his lady's command, who by his own hand, who in mortal chains, who in power, and who, shall I say, is calling? So let's just take a moment to what is Leonard Cohen's take or wrestling with the challenge of Unetaneh Tokef. What is his interpretation? Where does he put the emphasis? You can either put in the chat or raise your hand. Anyone? Yeah, Robin, can you unmute?
So look, I think he's looking at the absurdity of this. There's something, he's looking at the darkness and and actually what he's saying is almost antithetical to Unetaneh Tokef in the sense that he's not saying teshuvah and tzedakah and tefillah avert the evil decree. He's really talking about the absurdity of it and this happening to people. It's universal, the universal experience, and that there's no, he's saying there's really no explanation. This is the universal experience. It's absurd. I feel like he's talking about this as we don't have power over this, and it's our universal absurd experience.
Okay, so he unifies in some way humanity in this experience of encountering this. He adds a decent number of things to the list that weren't included, some of which are more, you could say, sarcastic, like who in the merry, merry month of May, right? There's a certain, I think that's where some of the absurdity comes in. What else? Tony, and then Shari. Can you unmute? You need to unmute.
What I'm noticing is that pretty much in each phrase here, each line, he puts in opposites, who by avalanche, who by powder. So he, in that way, to play on Robin, he really does include both extremes of how people would live and who people would be, who by greed, who by hunger, so that there's not a place for you to run away.
Beautiful. So it's like
one,
an all-inclusive, like Aleph to Taf or A to Z in that
right.
way. Yes.
So that's one thing I'm noticing. And the other thing that I'm noticing is when he says, who shall I say is calling? I mean, he's really saying, hey, God, who are you?
Right. This is the kicker of the song, right?
Yeah.
Because no one is questioning in Unetaneh Tokef who's in charge, or if there
Right.
is someone in charge. The affirmation is this is a day of judgment, and God is counting God's sheep, and God is Melech Chai V'Kayam, the enduring and ruling God, right? So in that way, he flips the accusation from one on humanity towards God's self, right? The assumption is we all go through all this, but who are you actually? We don't know that you live, that you are what you say you are, or even are there, which is just to emphasize the absurdity that Robin spoke to, which is there anyone actually there? Yes, Shari and then Achsa.
It's interesting. I don't know that he meant it like this, but that line, and who shall I say is calling, it just made me think of, like, who are we, each one of us, like, who am I when I come to, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and for the following year? Like, who am I gonna make myself to be? And am I gonna allow myself and try to make any changes in myself?
Great. So I think, obviously that's one of the deep questions of the holiday. I think in Leonard Cohen's rendition of this, his bigger question is really a question of whether faith should exist at all. right? This is the opposite orientation. In many ways, he flips the poem on its head to say, we're the object in Unetaneh Tokef, we're being judged, God is the subject. And in Leonard Cohen's rendition of Unetaneh Tokef, God is actually the object and wondering even whether God exists. So it's actually articulates whether it's a crisis of faith or a lack of faith at all, that there's actually someone, that there's any order to the universe at all, which speaks back to Irv's comment, which is like, the world doesn't look the way Unetaneh Tokef says. And so this is Leonard Cohen's response to that. Like, we can't live in an illusion that there's someone making these decisions here. Let's call that one into the account, not us, right? Because this is the reality. Achsa.
I think, Felicia, your comments are so good and everybody's here. And, this is from his last album. You want it darker? It's like, no, I cannot go any darker than this. But
Yeah.
I see in this poem and in so many of his songs and his poetry, this tension between this passionate desire to believe, to believe there really is something and there is a just God, and this skepticism that the world just doesn't operate that way. I mean,
Yeah.
this longing and this grief, and to me, it really, who shall I say is calling? Or as several people have said, is anyone calling? And we have this amazing liturgy that I think so much expresses our desire to believe.
Right.
Whatever.
Beautiful. Thank you. So I know there are a lot of comments to be said. I'm cognizant of time, so I just want to move on. So I'm going to invite folks, if you'd like to write in the chat. I know there are many people here, so your comments, and we'll see as the class progresses if there's more chance to have more comments shared. So I think he articulates, and also just said, that there's, on the one hand, the recognition that the world has a deep darkness to it, right? Like that we live with a lot of pain. We don't have to search that far to know that to be true. Some of us are more proximate to others, and we're searching for some sense to be made out of the world. And he articulates that question. Is there a sense to be made out of the world? And is there someone in charge of that world? Which is the assumption of Unetaneh Tokef, at least on kind of the baseline, but whether its ultimate job was to do that is a question. I mean, obviously the liturgy is meant to be that way in a certain sense. So I want to now look at another, we've looked at this before. Let me go back to this is a poem, a piyut. It's a poem by Admiel Kozman, who is, he is a Israeli who lives in, he's in charge of the Geiger Institute for making rabbinical students and rabbis in Europe. And he has another voice on, another commentary, you could say, on Unetaneh Tokef. And just for the folks who, if you remember Rabbi Aubrey Glazer, who both was here for the Dylan concert as well as the Leonard Cohen concert, he actually translated this. So just to give him that honor. So I'm just going to read his version of commentary on Unetaneh Tokef and see what do we learn from his commentary. Piyut for Musaf of Rosh Hashanah. And just how are you looking down from on high? Poteach od shana, beginning another year. And just how do you take account of us as bleeding sheep approaching you on the platform? And what are you saying about us, about the tree, the fruit, the bird, the animal, and the beast? And just how is it that you measure us front and center on the holidays of the year? And just what tax were you talking about? How much will you ask? And just how will you burn us? How will you throw it into the water first? And who will be the first to fall in the fire? What have you written above? Please tell me. about the 70 types of death sentences. What new forms will you create this time? Listen, you alone are the one that hovers above. You, valiant, dumbfounding, impressive. We are a withering bud. We are a flock of sheep bleating in the pen. You measure and count. We, straws in the wind, tossed wildly upon the grain heap. Yet only you stir the spirit on the earth's crust. So just take a minute and maybe just we'll have a couple reflections in the chat. And if you have a comment to make, again, I'll only take a handful of comments. What do you think Admiral Kazman is trying to articulate about Unetaneh Tokef, or his, and he's, by the way, right, intentional, he calls it Piyut Musaf Shel Rosh Hashanah. He's putting it in the language of a piyut, which is liturgical poem. He wants us to see it as, with the heft, of course, of Unetaneh Tokef. What are some reflections? Cassie has a lot of reflections, my dog. What do people think about his interpretation?
Felicia, what were the last couple of lines? I'm sorry, I didn't hear them.
They're right on the screen. I'm sorry if you didn't. It's on the left-hand side of the page. If you can't see, can folks see it? Yeah. So the last lines are, listen, you alone are the one that hovers above. You, valiant, dumbfounding, impressive. We are a withering bud. We are a flock of sheep bleating in the pen. You measure and count. We, straws in the wind, toss wildly upon the grain heap. Yet only you stir the spirit on the earth's crust.
Thank you.
Thoughts, reflections on what he brings. Yeah, Robin.
He's being confrontational. I feel as though he's saying, he's accusing God, the 70 types of death, who are you going to rain this on? I feel like he's being, instead of being reverent, he's being irreverent.
Yeah, I think it's true, right? Some of the language that's used here is provocative in the sense that it's not only descriptive in the ways that Leonard Cohen says, well, this way and that way, but this is kind of like, you creative God, you're so creative that you can still come up with all these horrible ways to inflict pain upon us, right? Like that's part of your power, and part of God's innovation is a sense to add multiple layers to all the ways we can suffer in this world. So there is an accusation and a provocation to say, you up there, hey, this is what you're giving us, really, thanks a lot. And he doesn't only say that. Leonard Cohen, I think, leaves us with this kind of question, who's calling, who's there, is there to be faith? But I think that the last third of the poem has a different balance than the opening part of the poem. Anyone have thoughts on how it kind of, sorry, I keep moving it, apologies. What he's trying to do towards the end. So I'll just share my take if no one is gonna. I think he is wrestling. He wants to be able to provoke and also rail at a world that is so fraught with pain and suffering, and that doesn't seem to actually diminish, but seems to accumulate and expand. And at the same time, the fact he still acknowledges how vulnerable we are, right? He uses the same kind of language. You are alone, you're unique, you're separate, and we here are still that withering folk, that we are still the sheep. I can rail all I want, but I'm still mortal. I'm still fragile. I'm still vulnerable. And yet there's something about you that makes me want to turn to you, right? There's a certain amount of, I think, the end, V'rakatame shiv haruach al haklafe ha'adama, that only you, and this is a reference, of course, to Mashiv haruach HaMorida Gashem, that God is the one who causes the wind to blow and the rain, that when we pray for rain, it's like, even with all this accusation and provocation, there's still, as opposed to saying, but who's calling, he still acknowledges the state of humanity, which is to be in such a vulnerable and fragile state, and also to seek something to turn to something that will lift our spirit, that will mashiv haruach, that will stir the spirit of the earth to a place that something will seem good. So I think in that way, it has a different quality than Leonard Cohen's poem, which is in some way, it's a wider range of emotions, which is, it allows for the anger and the provocation. It allows for the recognition of how painful the world can be. And it also acknowledges the human state, which is so deeply vulnerable and fragile and still searching and looking. And so in many ways, I think it's a wider range of emotions that he's trying to bring forth, all of which, except for the anger piece and the provocation, exists within the context of Unetaneh Tokef, but the opening piece is much more, obviously it is not contained in Unetaneh Tokef. So those are two creative interpretations of Unetaneh Tokef, and I think speak to some of often our challenges with Unetaneh Tokef, which is, we live in a very desperate world that is filled with lots of pain and suffering. Some of us have experienced that very deeply and directly, and it doesn't look as if paragraph 2, the section 2, is in direct relationship to section 3, which is that all the ways that people live long or short are in some way in relationship to their teshuvah, tefillah, and tzedakah, to our agency, doesn't appear in the way the world functions, that our actions are in relationship to our suffering. We all know folks who are filled with goodness and holiness and seek that out and suffer in terrible things. And we also know people who have done terrible things who just seem to get by. So this in many ways is the greatest theological challenge of Unetaneh Tokef, which is put right in the centerpiece of the liturgy, and in many ways I think is magnified in a macro sense during the entirety of the High Holy Days, which is, how do we live in relationship to a world that doesn't seem to have any order or relationship of cause and effect between our actions and the way, you could say, punishment is meted out. And so, which is, I think, at the crux of what we struggle with this poem. And I think is at the crux of what it means to be human. And when we suffer, I think we're often, at least in my experience in my years in the rabbinate, often when things that are terrible happen, we just, marked 21 years of September 11th. And I remember so distinctly after September 11th, how many people said, how could God do this? It's not a theology that we purport to believe in, but in the midst of suffering, we actually return to it in some very visceral orientation. And so what are we left with then, I think, is the question. And so there's Rabbi Gordon Tucker, Dr. Gordon Tucker, actually gave a 2-session class on Unetaneh Tokef at Hartman at the beginning of the pandemic in anticipation of the High Holy Days. And so I want to just honor that some of the sources that I'm going to share with you now are in gratitude to his teaching. So I'm going to open. So what I want to look at is the 4th section. Well, let's first I want to say a couple of things about the 2nd and 3rd section. I think most of us think about the 2nd and 3rd section being in relationship with each other, right? There are all these things that happen and how we die, and whether we're old or whether you're young, by fire or by water, etc. And then teshuvah, tefillah, tzedakah is the ways to temper that decree, essentially, that our agency is to temper that terrible list that we just encountered. And therefore, it's a kind of a conditional orientation between section 2 and section 3. And one of the things that I think is interesting to think about is to recognize that in section 2, we know these to be true. The world functions in a way that we know very terrible things happen of which we are not in control of, like who's calling, right? That we don't know why they happen. There's a deep mystery to why they happen. Some people attribute them to God, others attribute them to other things, but there is a certain amount of things that are true about the way that terrible list that is in Unetaneh Tokef exists that we actually have no control over. It's our inability to control is part of what that list is about. And the 3rd section, teshuvah, tefillah, tzedakah, is the opposite, is that actually there are things that we have the power to control, right? That the course of our lives are changed if we think about the ways that we wrestle with our demons. And so it is not true that we are not in control at all. There's the realm of things that we don't have control over, and there is a realm that we do have control over. And in some way, that 3rd section points to that. We cause our own suffering in many ways. We have a deep ability to inflict pain on each other and ourselves. And so there is an element, but maybe we don't have to put them always directly in relationship, is that there's an aspect of the world that we are not in control over, and there is an aspect of the world that we are in control over, and both of them break us, essentially. That is part of the awesome, scary, and fearful nature of what it means to be human, which is that the things we can control are trembling, like I always say this, my bubby used to say, make sure it's a good plane. Like every time I got on a plane, like that's what I think, like this could be the plane that crashes, like that. We live with kind of that absurdity of what can happen in the world, of things that we're not in control of. And it makes us fearful. It causes us to feel deeply fragile. It causes us to sometimes change our lives. It causes a deep amount of unrest and fear. And it breaks us because we experience tragedy and we experience pain, both directly and within the context of the world. And in the 3rd section, we also are broken about all the ways we screw up our lives. We make mistakes, we hurt people, we don't take care of our addictions, we don't seek the help that we need. All the things, the long list of why we're actually in this process often for the High Holy Days is to say, like, I actually do have agency, and the things that I have control over, I make mistakes and they break me too. I'm a broken human being. And so in many ways, I think there's something deeply powerful about acknowledging both are true. We live in a world that we don't control, and we live in a world that there are things that we do control. And so then we're left with the question of how do we end this poem that ends acknowledging our deep vulnerability with all these metaphors, right? That our origin is dust and we return to dust. And then he cites, the poet cites 8 metaphors for what it means to be a human being. And they're all citations from the Tanakh. To a broken shard, withering grass, row of flower, passing shadow, faded cloud, fleeting breeze, scattered dust, a vanishing dream. So what's interesting that Rabbi Gordon Tucker points out is there's only one of these in the list that is actually not a metaphor in its citation. So you wouldn't necessarily know that by the list, but it's actually the first thing on the list, which is kacheres hanishbar, to a broken shard. It's a broken earthenware. And it's the only thing of these 8 metaphors, only one that lives within the Torah itself. And it's from actually Leviticus. And it comes from Leviticus, where the earthenware is the holder of the chatat offering, the sin offering of the sacrifice. So I'm going to change now the screen back to the other sheet. So this is the citation of Kacheres Hanishbar. V'chol cheresh asher tivushal bo, yishaver ve'im bechli nechoshed, v'shula u'merok u'shtaf b'mayim. An earthen vessel, it's translated as an earthen vessel here, in which it was boiled shall be broken. If it was boiled in a copper vessel, the vessel shall be scoured and rinsed with water. Okay, so we're living in the book of Leviticus, in the sacrificial system, and the different ways that sacrifices are offered. And in this case, there are different vessels that hold the sacrifices and that are burned, etc. So we see here in this particular pasuk that the earthen vessel is differently treated than the copper vessel, right? The earthen vessel has to be broken and the copper vessel can be scoured and rinsed with water. So just to notice, again, this is the only thing on the list that's true to its experience in the Torah. Everything else is understood to be a metaphor, all those other citations. So the Mishnah Kelim is the section of the Mishnah, the first layer of rabbinic literature, codified in around 220. Mishnah Kelim means instruments, and instruments, the vessels for the sacrificial system. By the way, this stuff is written and it's applied after, it's interpreted after it actually has any import, because the sacrificial system is already over. So they're interpreting this even without its applicability. Nonetheless, here we go. Vessels of wood, vessels of leather, vessels of bone, or vessels of glass. If they are simple, they are clean. If they form a receptacle, they are unclean. So this is the notion of what's tahor and what's tameh, what is pure ritually and what's impure. If they were broken, they become clean again. So something that's broken becomes clean again. If one remade them into vessels, they are susceptible to impurity. Henceforth, earthen vessels and vessels of sodium carbonate are equal in respect of impurity. They contract to convey impurity through their air space. That in Hebrew it's ba'avir, in the air. Where they get their impurity is not through the external material of the earthenware, but what happens in the space in between, in the bowl. They convey impurity through the outside, but they do not become impure through their backs. And when broken, they become clean. So the focus here is on certain kinds of vessels that have air in them, like the inner space, and what makes them pure and what makes them impure. Bear with me. So the next text says, and this Bartanora is a 16th century commentary on the Mishnah. It's actually often included, just like Rashi is included in commentaries, like within Torah, the Chumash. Often Bartanora is included in Mishnah. So he says, all of vessels and utensils, breaking them is their purification, but earthenware vessels and vessels of alam crystal, breaking them alone purifies them. They have no purification through ritual immersion other than through breaking them alone. So earthenware vessels, which is kacheres hanishbar, earthenware vessels, the only way to purify them is by breaking them. So when we think about this idea, why is this metaphor used in Unetaneh Tokef? Because we are the earthenware vessel, right? We in chapter 2 in the book of Bereshit, we know that God formed us out of the earth. We are the earthenware vessel. And what is our avir? What's our avira? What's the airspace? Does anyone know what that's a reference to in the metaphor with us? It's God's breath being blown within us, right? In chapter 2, right, that's what God does. God, according to the story, God takes the earth, forms the earth and forms human beings, and then blows essentially life into us. That's the avir. And so oh my goodness, I don't know what's going on out there. But so here, this non-metaphor that lives in the Torah is included in as the first of this list of metaphors. And then it's made into a metaphor from Leviticus into how human beings are understood, recognizing that what makes us pure is brokenness. And then this text of Menachem, the Kutzker Rebbe, Menachem Mendel of Kutsk, in his teaching says, the reason that an earthenware vessel only contracts and transmits impurity through its airspace and cannot be purified by immersion, tefillah, like most things can be purified through ritual immersion, is because earthenware substance has no real value, being simply earth. Its only importance is due to its having an inner space that can receive and hold other things. Thus, it cannot be susceptible to impurity through its outer wall, but only through its inner space, which is its main identity. And so it is with human beings who are dust of the earth. They have significance only if there is substance. Oh, I didn't finish. Substance within. So here, is this idea that we, like the earthenware vessels, have the chance to put back the pieces from our brokenness, and that allow God's breath to come within us again. That's the essence of what makes us who we are. The vessel, our bodies, is just the container for what's most essential to us, which is our soul, right? That, and in many ways, I think this is a deeply powerful thing to consider within the context of Unetaneh Tokef. And I'm just going to go back to the Unetaneh Tokef again, which is to say that we are broken by both aspects of the second section and the third section. We are broken by all the terror that the world hoists upon us. And we are also broken by all the terrible things we do to ourselves, the things that we control. And in some way, there is the sense that in our brokenness, we might find the possibility of confronting that breaks us. And we might have the possibility again of putting ourselves back together if we allow God, Melech el-Chai v'Kayam, which is the culmination of Unetaneh Tokef, to find God's way in us again. That's the possibility of repair. So I think it's a very I think we're never going to have an answer to the inconsistencies of living. We're never going to be able to perfectly analyze why the universe is, obviously there's science, there's why floods occur. There's a lot of things about climate change that inform why the weather is what it is. We can explain a lot. But ultimately, there's the deep unknown. And what it means to be human is to feel these deep, very deep things, which is a confrontation between the world as it is, which is deeply painful and challenging in many, many ways, of which we don't have the answer to everything, and simultaneously with our profound agency to make a difference. And that confrontation that occurs in Unetaneh Tokef allows us to fall apart, in a sense. We are given permission to fall apart, with the hope that that is our greatest strength, to let something into us again, to find our way back to rebuild. So I think there are obviously all different ways to think about this poem, from Leonard Cohen to Admiel Cosman to some of these references that are kind of a subtlety of I think thinking about the why of the power of this poem, of traveling in many ways through our different experiences of living, which is, some of that is profound affirmation of what we experience. Some of it is profound disruption and anger at what we experience. Some of it is deep disappointment in ourselves and others in what we experience. And basically, the recognition of the facing of our lives with our fragility and our mortality and our brokenness. And the process of acknowledging the totality of that, even if one thing is not necessarily conditional upon the other, creates potentially a pathway to rebuild, which is not only in some way built into Unetaneh Tokef, if one reads it that way, but is built into the Yamim Nora'im as an entirety, as a whole. In some way, Unetaneh Tokef, I think, is a microcosm of the macrocosm of the experience of traveling through the High Holy Days. That we come out being able to say, God has breathed life into me again, and I'm going to walk in the world with the potential to live a holy existence. Yes, Bob or Amy, who's raising their hand? Bob.
Thank you.
I figured that was true, but I was just giving the possibility.
Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you for a very good, clear walk through a very disturbing set of texts. I just want to say that in the natural world, all living things must be mortal in order for life to exist through natural selection. This is not a biology seminar, but I can guarantee that there are no immortal individuals in nature of any species. And I think what you've captured and what the text brings us to is, while alive, to try to imagine the meaning of death, the breaking of the vessel, and to think about how may we, while the vessel is functioning, while we are breathing, act in such a way that when we are broken and not present, we are still present in the minds and memories of other people in a good way. I think that's the thread that links links these different ways of saying, you can't control it, it's going to come to an end, we're in trouble. It's a dark set of prayers, but I think they reinforce the notion that while we are here, we have a gift as well as an obligation to live in such a way that, because we're mortal, we will be remembered well. I just wanted to add that.
Beautiful. Thank you, Bob. I'm having trouble with my Zoom now that I stopped sharing. I think Sonia had a hand raised. Is that true?
Thank you. Yes, just briefly, that was beautiful, Felicia. If I understood it correctly, doesn't the falling apart, the breaking apart also as earthenware make us pure. And so there's something about, the purity of the dust, essentially, that we are made of.
Yes, I mean, that is at the essence, of course, an orientation. I mean, that nothing is more pure than essence, in the sense, but in some way, rather than kind of thinking about that our soul is pure, I mean, the soul is God, but in this case, the container, the human being, the only way to get to purity is through brokenness, which means to acknowledge vulnerability. And there are many texts on that, of course. God only wants a broken heart. We've studied those texts over the years, but I think this is, again, I mean, I continue to use this word, the imagination of the tradition to hold something that's so physical in the sacrificial system, and then dream it into a story about our potential as human beings and the nature of our life. I mean, we're talking about vessels, that held the sacrificial offerings, and now that's us, and the fact that the tradition is able to make those connections between all the stories. So I just think, I'm never gonna be able to solve theologically. There have been many smart theologians over time, choices in modern Jewish thought, like all these ways that there have been theologians wrestling with our existence and what God does or what God doesn't do. And we wrestle with how the liturgy interacts with our lived experience and our search. Really, in many ways, I think we live both in Leonard Cohen, not just in Leonard Cohen, Admiel Cosman, and we live in these texts as they are shared, which is we live with a search, like, who's calling, or am I being called at all, right? And then we also live with provocation and anger because of the ways the world, and we want something to comfort us and give us a nechama, to give us comfort in the midst of a swirling universe. And just like the tradition tries to make meaning through interpreting an earthen vessel to be us, and the only way to make us pure is by breaking, is the meaning making in all of us. And I think this time of year is meant to evoke all of those kinds of questions. And we're blessed with a tradition, a Mahzor, that even as it agitates us, also searches for us to find answers to our agitation. And over the years, I think if it weren't for all that agitation, we wouldn't have a tradition. Like, that's what bugs, what bothers our sages of old, of modern thinkers, etc., is also what produces meaning. And so that would be my last invitation, is as we encounter the liturgy over the course of these weeks ahead, is to sit in the places of agitation rather than close the book, rather than shut out. There's an invitation there somewhere, even if it's to write a different story. And we've been blessed in that way to live in a tradition that is continuing to voice those kinds of questions and those kinds of poems year in and year out. So I hope as we arrive with Unetaneh Tokef that we'll experience a little bit of the richness of that poem with all the emotion that it brings. And we'll conclude with my dog barking continually and Kadisha Rabbanan. If you'd like to rise, please do so. It's on page 20 in the Siddur. Yitgadal v'kadash shemei Rabbah v'amad yirach yirutei v'yamlich malchutei b'chayachon v'yamechon v'chayedecho beit Yisrael b'galau v'zman karev v'yamru amen. Yehi shemei Rabbah mevarach le'odam omei omaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei nekudesha b'richu Leila min kol chatav shirata. Tushbachata v'nechamata damiran lama v'yamru amen.
Amen.
Al Yisrael v'al Rabbanan v'al Tamidehon v'al kol Tamidehon v'al kol man daskin ba'oraita diva tra haden v'diva chol atar v'atar Yehi lahon u'chon shlama rava china v'chista v'rachamin v'chayin arechinu v'zona revichar v'kanamin kadamahon v'shamaya v'yamru amen.
Amen.
Yehi shlama rava min shamaya v'chaim tovim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yamru amen.
Amen.
Oseh shalom b'mromav u'barachamav yaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'al kol Yisrael Yamru. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.